All right, I think we're ready. So today we're going to discuss, we'll begin by discussing a number of letters from the Rebbe Rashab, and the concept here that I'm using today is this idea I've had for a while, which is that it's my belief that there are many things, many inyanim, both in Chassidus, as we've seen so far, but in history as well, in Nigla as well, that were written by the Rebbeim, that the Rebbeim were involved in, but despite having technically been printed, so technically it's out there, the information's out there, but they're not famous, they're not well known, people are not familiar with them, and there's so much that really deserves to get its turn in the spotlight. So one method, one technique I use to pinpoint, to land on a topic, is I'll search the date, particularly in the Igros of the Rebbeim. If you search that day's date, you'll often find, certainly in the Rebbe's Igros, you'll find something for any date of the year. In the Frierdiker Rebbe's Igros, obviously it's a matter of statistics. Frierdiker Rebbe's Igros, a good chance you'll find something. Maybe there are a few days that don't, maybe a few dates that don't have something. But in the Alter Rebbe, Mittel Rebbe, Tzemach Tzedek, and Marash, and Rebbe Rashab as well, there's a chance that you might find something. So as it happens today, I was searching for the date of Ches Kislev, and in fact I came across a letter of the Rebbe Rashab that touches on a halachic topic that is not well known at all, and we'll discuss that letter, and we'll discuss another letter of the Rebbe Rashab, not from this date, but on a related topic, and we'll expand a bit on that. So we begin by looking at this letter from the Rebbe Rashab. It's printed in Chelik Gimel, Agunah number 804. It's pages Shinai and Aleph, Shinai and Bey. For those who are familiar with the Rebbe Rashab's Igros, or really the Igros of all the Rebbeim, unfortunately, fortunately, the Rebbe instructed Kahas, Rebbe 11, to start printing the Igros in the 80s. The Igros of all the Rebbeim, that project began then. So for that, at least we have a partial record, or a more than partial record, of the letters and correspondence sent by the Rebbeim. But unfortunately, take the Rebbe Rashab, for example. When Rebbe 11 started, he had a certain number of letters he was working with, and he printed those letters in 2 volumes, Chelik Aleph and Chelik Beis. And then it's not clear to me offhand why such a large quantity only immediately presented itself afterwards, but not that long afterwards, Rebbe 11 obtained much more material. I guess there were different archives, different collections, and he printed the Chelik Gimel, Chelik Dalet, and Chelik Hey. So the clock starts over again. The dating, the chronology starts over again, and there are many chapters of the Rebbe Rashab's life that the Rebbe Rashab was involved in, where half the story is in Chelik Aleph or Chelik Beis, and the other half is in Chelik Gimel, Dalet, Hey. And then a few years ago, they also printed a Chelik Vav of a few additional letters that have shown up in the last couple of decades. Just as a general observation about the Igros. So this is in Chelik Gimel, Agunah 804. But like I said, 804 doesn't mean chronologically, it just means in the order they were printed. So there's a letter from this date, from today's date, Yom Beis, Ches Kislev, Tafresh Samach Gimel, Lubavitch. And this letter is written to Yedid Nefesh, Yed Nafshi, Harav Meforsim, Pasuk V'chasad Nichbed U'Meroimim, Yirei Elokim, Chulu, all the titles, Reb Eliezer Moshe, I believe his last name was Madayevsky, one of the Rabbanim, Chassidim, that the Rebbe Rashab would correspond with, Bechlal. Perhaps it's worth mentioning that the Rebbe Rashab's relationship with the Rabbanim and Askanim was different than the one maybe we're more familiar with from the Rebbe. The Rebbe Rashab, in his letters, always seemed to be genuinely consulting with and sharing his true feelings with the Rabbanim and the Askanim of Chabad, Lubavitch, that he was in touch with at the time. Just 1 second, I realized that I need to charge the computer, or else we're going to have a problem. Apologies while we deal with this technical issue. 1 second. Sorry about that. All right. So this was written, as we said, it was written to Eliezer Moshe Mateyevsky, and like I said, the Rebbe Rashab would share a lot more in these letters with the Rabbanim and Askanim. Although the truth is that there are a lot of letters from the Rebbe where the Rebbe also shares deeper thoughts and feelings, and a lot of them weren't printed. And lately, in the last year or so, more have been printed, and that's a whole story in its own right. But at any rate, the Rebbe Rashab writes on Yom Beis Ches Kislev Tafish Samach Gimel to Rebbe Eliezer Moshe. And as is often the case in these letters, we don't have the entire text of the letter. There's an ellipsis here that indicates that at least a portion of the letter has been omitted for whatever reason, different reasons, different rules that the editors of the Igros use to decide what should be included, what should not. But the letter, as we have it, begins with the following passage. The Rebbe Rashab says that what the papers are reporting about an Asifas HaRabbanim is false, it's fake news, as we say today. So this is Tafish Samach Gimel, this is the end of 1902. So apparently there had been some rumors, some discussion in the Hebrew press, probably at the time, that there might be some kind of Asifas HaRabbanim. And the Rebbe Rashab says it's false, it's fake, it's not happening. As we know, there were many different Asifas of Rabbanim in Russia in those decades generally. Some were fully formal, official, government-sanctioned events. Others were perhaps related to developments in dealing with the government. And it's a whole parsha for itself. We're not going to get too deep into that. But seems like there was talk of an Asifas HaRabbanim. Rebbe Rashab says it's not true. And the Rebbe Rashab goes on to explain as follows. Kasher Yadua, Sheroitze Mikvar, Lasas Chadashes Binyone Ishus. It's well known that it's already a while that they're trying to introduce innovations in serious matters that relate to Jewish marriage. So, for example, they want to put a time limit on agunah. So they want to institute that if 3 years pass, if a man disappears and 3 years pass and he doesn't surface, doesn't show up, so then the new Jewish law, the new rule should be that she's no longer an agunah up to 3 years, and that's it. Then her status as an agunah expires. That is what they're talking about. That's what they would like to institute. And similarly, regarding chalitza, where you could have similar issues where a woman is stuck needing chalitza in order to move on. So they would like to make changes to the laws of chalitza similarly as well. It's probably worth mentioning in brief that if anyone familiar with what was going on at the time, especially with the immigration, there was a very large agunah problem, and I guess to some degree a chalitza problem as well. And we'll touch a little bit on it a bit further. We've been signed a few Mara Mekaimis, but you open the press, you open the papers, the American Jewish papers at the time, you would find there was a column where they would actually post pictures of men who had vanished was a very common occurrence, both back in Russia, but even in America, for that matter. There were more and more opportunities for men who were frustrated with their lot in life to just vanish, disappear, and try their luck reinventing themselves somewhere else. So it took this problem to a much greater scale than there had ever been before. Traditionally, historically, an agunah was typically someone where the husband genuinely went off to travel and probably was murdered or drowned, and the body wasn't recovered. That's generally, typically, the main sense of agunah historically. Occasionally, men also did run off, and that could be an issue, but this issue really peaked around this time that the Rebbe Rashab was writing. And this was pretty well-known basic fact to everyone at the time, and that's why pressure was building, especially as Jews were becoming more secularized, and not everyone felt so beholden to the old halachas. So even while the status quo still was that people got married, Kedas Moshe Yisrael, not everyone getting married was fully committed to halacha. Not all, obviously, at that time, there were other streams of Judaism that were appearing, that had different relationship to settled halacha than the Orthodox Jewish world had and has today. So it was a moment, a time when things were in flux, and this was a lightning rod that was gaining a lot of attention, and there was a lot of chatter about what could be done at that time as well. We know that the Russian government had its own rabbinate. There were rabbis who were approved by the Russian government, which required dafka having higher education, which many traditional rabbanim didn't have. So often you had, even though it wasn't Orthodox versus Reform, but you had the more Hamish Rav versus the Rav Mitam. The Rav Mitam may or may not have been fully observant, fully Orthodox. So you may have had rabbanim, rabbis recognized by the government, who may have been more open to introducing changes versus the more traditional rabbanim gedolim that we're familiar with. So this is all what the Rebbe Rashab is alluding to, Bekitzer, that they're spreading news about the Asifas HaRabbanim, but really it's not true, but really they're just trying to, I guess, create momentum about this changing the status of Ishrus and Chalitza. And now he alludes to certain individuals, perhaps Rabbanim Mitam, who want to lases chukim ka'ela, who want to make laws like this. It's not clear to me if they fully wanted to reform halacha or whether they just wanted to create some kind of secular law, meaning until then, presumably, historically, we know Jews, there was no common law. If you were Christian, you have to follow Christian law. If you were Jewish, you have to follow Jewish law. And in other parts of Europe around this time, this had changed, and there was just common marriage, common divorce, and that many decades earlier had already undermined the Jewish institution of marriage in many lands. That, I presume, had not happened yet in Russia, but there would be, I assume, some kind of change in the law that would allow Jews who identify as Jews to perhaps follow these rules of their choice. And these people, these individuals that have some power, some sway over the laws that govern the Jewish community, they have almost reached the state in which they're going to go ahead. They want to go ahead with this without even asking the Rabbanim. As we know, throughout the history of Russia, often the government was agitating and itching to change certain rules, certain laws, certain practices with regard to the Jewish community. But if they actually took the time to ask the Rabbanim, so then you would have the Asifas, and you would have the drama, and the Rabbanim would be fighting, and we know with the Tzemach Tzedek and the Rebbe Rashab, etc. This was often the case regarding different matters. So in this case, they might even be looking to circumvent the Rabbanim. The Rabbanim already asked this. This came up at the previous Asifa. I don't know, maybe I have an error in my text, either v'amru v'asru lahachlet be'isr gomer. So this came up at an actual Asifa, the previous Asifa, and there was a resounding no. In the footnotes there, Rebbe 11 says it's referring to the Asifa of Tafresh Nun Daled, which, as we'll see briefly, was seemingly, it seems, the end of December 1893 or the beginning of January 1894, the winter of Tafresh Nun Daled. There was an asifa, and there already was momentum pressure on these issues at the time. They asked the Rabbanim said no, and that's where they left it. So now they're coming back around for round two. Now they don't want to, they don't even want to ask. And the leaders of their religions also oppose it. I'm not sure if he literally means actual Christian denominations in Russia as well, in which case it sounds like certainly these chukim were meant to be chukim that were binding for the entire nation, and other religious groups opposed these rules as well. I guess laws that could dissolve a marriage, a religious marriage. And yet, etc. Meaning, I guess, even the fact that the other religions oppose it isn't swaying them. They want to put the ball in people's court, that they should be able to decide what they'd like to do. It's clear that there'll be many mechshalim. This will be terrible in terms of following halacha. And he refers to a certain Rav, Tzvi Hirsch Rabinowitz, is now in Petersburg, and he intends to submit a macha, protest, and looks like he'll be involved with this. He'll be dealing with it. He'll be leading the response, the rabbinic response to this. And the Rebbe Rashab quotes someone who told Rabbi Rabinowitz that someone in Petersburg, I think his name was Schlossberg, one of the Gvirim, powerful Jews that were also involved in Askanas. He says Schlossberg told Rabbi Rabinowitz, even if they're trying to get these laws passed, it's certainly going to take many years. So that's the true story. That's what's really happening behind the scenes. They want to pass these laws, and whatever the press was talking about Asifas Rabbanim is false news that's somehow a byproduct of this agitation at this time. And there are a few other passages in the letter between the Rebbe Rashab and Rebbe Madievsky that are not negayah to us. And the Rebbe Rashab concludes the letter, signs the letter. So I did actually want to go looking, and I wanted to research and see if we have other reports, other evidence of this parsha at the time, of this pressure to be mater agunah and mater yavamis. And in fact, if you search, of course, the main resource that one might use, or that I'm using at least, is the National Library of Israel's collection of newspapers, unbelievable resource. They have just incredible collection of Jewish newspapers, Jewish press, going back as early as possible, and Hebrew, Yiddish, English, many other languages as well. There's even Ladino papers that existed at different times, and many other languages as well. And you can limit your search to particular dates, particular range of dates. So if you search around December 1893 for the first asifa that Rebbe Rashab references, if you search December 1893 and January 1894, in fact, you will find in Hamelitz and the other Hebrew papers at the time as well, that they were in fact covering this asifa, and they were in fact covering this particular issue specifically at the time. You could see much coverage of that at the time. We're not going to begin quoting chapter and verse, but if you'd like the links, I could certainly share it, or we can share it on the chat dedicated to these shiurim. As well as if you search Tafresh Samach Gimel, the period when the Rebbe Rashab wrote this letter, you search for agunah, chalitza, you can also find a number of articles about the matter at the time as well. I'll just mention an interesting detail that I noticed, that in Hamelitz, which was one of the main Hebrew papers in Russia or that area at the time, Hamelitz, which was covering this issue, there's a letter to the editor in Hamelitz, the issue of December 23, 1902, and someone is writing to Hamelitz about, he's just giving his input, his take on the chalitza problem. Is there a chalitza problem? And it seems like his point, the point he was trying to make was there isn't such a big chalitza problem in the city that I'm in. We haven't had many major issues of chalitza being dragged out. And he says there are only 3 times where the brothers didn't want to do chalitza, and that was specifically because they'd already gotten into a fight with the Yavama before, so there was some bad blood there. And one time he says it was because the chalotz was still single, and he was afraid that if he gives chalitza, he's going to lose his value on the marriage market, and the number of girls that will be interested in marrying him is going to shrink. Why is that? So this fellow writes, because in the lower levels, the lower classes of the Jewish community, there's still some popularity to the foolish opinion that there's it's not honorable, it's not dignified to marry a chalutz hanal. Someone who gave chalitza is not good marriage material. It's not someone you want to marry. And if you do marry a chalutz hanal, so then it's going to be bad news. So this was the belief. He calls it a dea evilis, a foolish belief. But due to that belief, this single fellow refused at the time to give chalitza. He doesn't say how the matter was resolved, but that's just an interesting detail. Historically, we know that from the Aaron Einon already that historically the deal was that the Yavam and the Yavama, the child, will be misyachas to the deceased brother. So that's a reason maybe why Yavam doesn't want to do Yibum. And also there's all the issues of I believe the Arizal talks about the neshama of the first husband is still hovering in the area. So I could understand in the context of getting married why some might hesitate, but the Minhag Ashkenaz is already a whole different topic, of course. But the Minhag Ashkenaz is not to do Yibum, and so I'm not sure. I didn't look, but I'm not sure why there would have been this belief. If there is a makar, I guess please let me know. But otherwise, if there's no makar, then it's interesting that there was this belief. If you want some more general historical perspective on this period in time and this issue with agunas, there is a book, The Plight of Jewish Deserted Wives, 1851 to 1900, that covers up to this time, by, I believe the author's name is Chaim Sperber. And if you look at his academia page, you'll see that he has many other articles and stuff he's written on the topic. Among other things, he has a piece there in Hebrew, agunah specific shalos and shuvas, where he actually, from a couple of years ago, we actually sought to draw up some statistics. The claim is that they've gone through all the shalos and shuvas and all the newspapers, and they drew up the precise numbers of known agunas that were known and discussed at the time. So there's some interesting numbers there and some interesting facts and figures. So that's on his academia page, agunah specific shalos and shuvas. Another historical chapter relating to this, there was an agunah from Odessa. Her name was Sarah Genner, not an agunah per se. I believe it was a chalitza problem where she needed chalitza, but the brothers were mishumadim. So her name was Sarah Genner of Odessa. There is an academic article on it in English called A Grass Widow in Odessa. And if you look in that article, actually, and you search 1893, you'll see that it actually mentions, it seems that perhaps at this very same asifa of Tafresh Nandaled, her particular case actually came up. In their discussion of agunas and chalitza, her particular case came up. It was a big sensation at the time. There were a number of other parshias around this time of a case where the Yavam was on Meshumad, and there were different Rabbanim who were seeking to be mater. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the famous Sefer Av B'Chachma, the default Sefer when you open Eitzer HaChachma by Rav Yehuda Levitz, I believe, deals in part with a proposed heter of his to deal with a case where the Yavam was a Meshumad, and many Rabbanim did not agree with his heter. There's a very sharp letter from the Rogatchover in the Sefer Av B'Chachma to him, where the Rogatchover calls him a bunch of names, and Rav Yehuda Levitz, Bleib Nishuldik, he responds and calls the Rogatchover a bunch of names, and it's pretty interesting that that's all in the first Sefer in the Av B'Chachma that's become it's become the first sefer in the Jewish library. So this parsha in Tafresh around this time, in Gimel and Daled with Odessa, was also one such case. And the fact there was a particular Rav, his name was Avram Yerel Abelson, who was leading the charge among more traditional Rabbanim to be mater. You can find in Hebrew books in Eitzar Chachma, his Kuntres Takones Agunos, Chelik Aleph and Chelik Beis. Also, a number of decades ago, descendants of the family reprinted. There's a Sefer Eitz Chaim Takones Agunos from the Abelson family. So that's another parsha that is illustrative of what was going on at the time, and also ties into the 1893 parsha. So that's that letter from Ches Kislev Tafresh Samach Gimel. While we're already on the topic of letters of Rebbe Rashab about agunah, I want to now segue into a very fascinating letter from Rebbe Rashab that's actually printed in Chelik Beis, letter 393. It's printed on pages Tafshin Lamed Gimel, Tafshin Lamed Daled, and it's from a few years after the previous letter, as I already explained. Chelik Beis has letters that are from after letters in Chelik Gimel. This is dated Ner HaShlishi Tafresh Ayin Daled. So Chanukah Tafresh Ayin Daled. So I didn't check the date, whether it's already 1914 or last days of 1913. And this letter is from Menton. So that's in France. I don't know if resort is the right term for it, but it's a place where the Rebbe Rashab, it is a vacation area. The Rebbe Rashab spent time there on this occasion, perhaps on other occasions as well. I believe someone once shared a picture that they actually tracked down this particular building that the Rebbe Rashab stayed in. Even though most of the other buildings from that era have been knocked down, that building is said to still be standing. So I believe it's a very pretty town vacation spot. So the Rebbe Rashab was there at the time, and he was writing letters, dispatches, as we may be familiar. If you're familiar with Rebbe Rashab's letters, he would write letters addressed to his son and to his daughter-in-law and to his granddaughters. Even though most of the letter concerned Yonei Askanis, etc., was really addressed to his son, but he also would address the entire letter to the rest of the family as well. Maybe he included passages that were more personal for them as well. So this letter. So this letter, the Rebbe Rashab begins with some other matters, technical matters that they were in touch with, touch about at the time, and then he writes that here, and there's some omission here, there's some censorship here, as we'll see. It's a very personal matter, so some of the identifying details regarding this personal matter have been removed. But here, ... Yichya and his wife Tichya. And he says she's in San Remo, which I believe is in Italy, and he came around now. He came to San Remo, and then he came here to meet me. So without knowing exactly who we're talking about, it's a little hard to understand who's who, what's what exactly. Maybe San Remo is a clue. Maybe if we search for San Remo, we can find other clues. But whatever the case is, it's someone the Rebbe Rashab knows, who lives nearby and came to meet the Rebbe Rashab in Menton. So the Rebbe Rashab writes to the Rebbe, Betach Neidelecha, you probably heard about his daughter, that she's the daughter-in-law of ... omitted. Asher Isha Nechle B'machla Azar Rachmana Litzlan. Her husband has a terrible affliction, a terrible illness. V'hu Asher Mehamachla Hanestara Syphilis Rachmana Litzlan. Machla Nestara is in Hebrew, and in parentheses, syphilis. Now, this is just a general disclaimer going forward. Syphilis, of course, is a sexually transmitted infection. And for the rest of this discussion, we're going to be discussing matters and illnesses such as this, and related facts and details. So I guess you can say there's a parental advisory in effect. So you have to decide whether you'd like to continue listening due to the fact that some concepts and terminology may not be for the very young. So it's interesting that Rebbe Rashab uses like a Hebrew euphemism, hamachla hanastara, but then in parentheses, the Rebbe Rashab says syphilis, rachmana litzlan. So from this, so as we know generally about syphilis Syphilis, we said, is a sexually transmitted infection. It spread around the time that Columbus discovered America. There's a big chakira, whether it was from America and spread back to the old world that way, or whether it came from somewhere else. But that's when we start really hearing about it and starts being identified. And it was back then, that was the main disease affliction for those that were licentious. That was the disease that they risked contracting, and there was no medicine, there was no cure, and it would begin as I believe it would begin as something on the skin. The skin would break out, but ultimately it would spread, and ultimately it would reach the brain, and then that was really the beginning of the end for the people afflicted with this disease. So that's why the Rebbe Rashab's wording is Asher me'amach lahanastara ba lo yamach lebahamayach. It reached his brain, and now once it reached his brain, chaser deya legamre rachmana litzlan. So he's completely lost his mind, and this was a common outcome, a common symptom of people who had syphilis. And right now he's institutionalized in Kiev. And the Rebbe Rashab says, sure, there's no cure. So he's institutionalized, what are they doing? So they feed him, they make sure he eats, he drinks, and they supervise him, but that's all they can do. He's otherwise there's no one home. You could say the problem, as we're about to explain, the problem perhaps is that physically he's very healthy. And Rebbe Rashab adds in parentheses, I'm aware of a case like this that was in Moscow, and in that case, it didn't take very long and he died. That was that case. Mikra Hazois, he's healthy and he's getting healthier as time goes on. So the rest of the body is doing great, and it's just the mind that's completely shot. The doctors say that he can live at this rate for 20 years. So, but the daughter is married to this person. So she's like a living widow with no hope. To give a get, it's not shaykh, and it's ruining her. And she's going crazy and saying she can't live like this. And they're afraid that often, as might be the case, that she'll just quit on sticking to the laws of Yiddishkeit, to treat herself like she's restricted. So that's chas v'shalom chulu. So the Rebbe Rashab, very interesting. Rebbe Rashab says there's only one way to be mater, mikavli ha'isser. Im yimatzei sha'kiddushin hayu kiddushay tos. If we can determine that the kiddushin in this marriage, due to what we know now, have transpired to be kiddushay tos, was all a mistake. They claim he already was afflicted with syphilis before he got married, earlier stages, and he completely withheld this information from her. And in fact, they claim that he even told someone at the time that he's withholding this from her because she'll surely not be willing to go ahead, but he wants to marry her. So this gives us insight into the fact that he himself believed that it's essentially kiddushay tos. Essentially, he needs to trick her, or else she won't want to agree to kiddushin. They claim they have a whole case to be made. The Rebbe Rashab adds, though, that I believe, though, that that aids, the specific detail about the man himself admitted, that aid is no longer around. So the Rebbe Rashab is that sort of shaila migdele rabbanim. So this is a shaila we need to bring to the great rabbanim, to the greatest rabbanim. But even to ask the question, we first need to do proper research. You can't show up and without a case. First, you have to build the case to see whether you can ask a shaila. Because if it's all just b'nuyim ba'avir, if it's just stam shmuas, so there's nothing to ask what to be ish or isha, to be mater a woman without a get. But if there's something serious, or you can last a shaila, machana shaila. So I told them they should hand the case over to a rav to do the initial research, and he should gather all the material. And then if this rav believes that there's a case to be made, then he'll travel to the great Rabbanim and they'll pose the question to the big Rabbanim. Or we could even bring it to the Asifas Rabbanim. We just fast forwarded here from letter to letter. Now we're in Tavish Ayin Daled. So there was talk of big Asifas Rabbanim around that time. So that was the next big one. So you could bring it to the Asifas Rabbanim. All the big Rabbanim will be there. So that's a great opportunity. You could just catch them all there. And you could even have a sitting on it. The old Rabbanim can sit and discuss it together. So that could work out great. So you can see the Rebbe Rashab is really getting involved here to advocate for this case and see what can be done. And the Rebbe Rashab says, I even have a name, I even have someone in mind of who could do the initial work. Reb Noach would be great for this. And in parentheses, the Rebbe Rashab says, Shechachti Shem Chinuchai. I forgot Reb Noach what? How's he known? Reb Noach something. I don't remember what it is, but you'll surely know who I mean. He last summer he visited me at Dacha for 2 weeks, and Rosenblum and Lubavitch also knows him. So we need someone who's very intelligent, who knows how to talk, but also someone who's honest, who's not going to scam the family, because he can scam the family. He's getting paid to do this, so there's money in it. So either he could scam in the sense that he could put together a false case. He could also just scam them. He can take their money and then drag it out and never even bring a shaila, because it's clear that the family is willing to pay anything. But this Reb Noach, he's not, we wouldn't suspect him of this chas v'shalom. He's going to do it honestly, and I know his conditions, what he's up to. He can leave town for a few months to work on this. So tell Rosenblum to write to Reb Noach, and if he's interested, then they would like him to come to San Ramo, and they'll transmit the entire case to him. And the wife of the mother in this case, she says she has leads of how to go about investigating it. She has a game plan. So the Rebbe Rashab says, I think first Reb Noach should stop in Kiev to see the guy himself who's institutionalized. And the Rebbe Rashab says, if I see so-and-so, probably the father of the woman, if I see him today, I'll ask him which institution specifically, he'd rather show up in Kiev having an address, not just knowing that he's somewhere in Kiev. Why is it important to see the guy first? Because 2 years earlier, someone, unclear, there's again ... but someone said that there are times where he has moments of clarity, and you have to get the right time to get him. So there are those who claim that he's not 100% shot, and the family, they say that it's not true. There's no such. He's never happens. But that would be Reb Noach's first stop to see for himself, first of all, what the actual situation is. So please have Rosenblum, Lubavitch, I believe he served as a shtickle secretary, write to him, and his response, or it could be possibly through Telegram, please let me know. And then the Rebbe Rashab added a few more matters, and that was the conclusion of the letter. So this is pretty interesting, pretty fascinating. First of all, specifically the case, the syphilis, but even specifically the fact that the Rebbe Rashab was seriously interested, considering the idea of pursuing the route of Kiddushay Tos. That's a big chiddush. And after I saw this in Igris, I saw that the Rebbe Rashab included this letter in. He printed a few years ago a sefer, Torah Shalom Shalos Tshuvos, where he collected all the halachic writings of the Rebbe Rashab in a sefer. So it's there, it's Siman Pei Beis, and in Siman Pei Gimel there, they quote another passage from a letter that the Rebbe Rashab wrote a while later in Teves, where it seems to be a follow-up to the same case. Rebbe Rashab writes to Frida Rebbe regarding the daughter of so-and-so. I wrote you in the, he's following up particular details. Who knows about it, who were sharing this, it's not meant to getting around. The Rebbe Rashab says all the potential Eidim in this case are not kosher le'edos, and one of them is no longer with us at all. Then there's another omission, and then it continues and it says, they say, the doctors say that the condition he's in now demonstrably means that he's already had the illness for 8 years earlier, meaning the illness first began 8 years ago for him to have advanced, to have gotten to the state that he's in now. So that's a helpful detail, helpful fact where we can create a timeline and prove when he must have already had the illness relative to when they got married. So that's the Rebbe Rashab is citing this as potentially a helpful point. The Rebbe Rashab adds, whether we could use this fact al pi din, I don't know, but I'm just sharing. The Rebbe Rashab is advocating and sharing all the any helpful details that the family had to offer. The Rebbe Rashab is sharing it and saying, the Rav would have to research it, the daily Harabanim would have to discuss it. I'm not getting into the halacha. I'm just giving the roadmap. The Rebbe Rashab concludes there and says, interestingly, the Rebbe Rashab seems to say here, please let me know whether the Bnei HaYeshiva looked into it. Sounds like that he's referring to the Talmidim in Lubavitch. Recently, I saw someone pointed out that in the Zechreinis of Lubavitch, we know that in the first Doiris, the Seder Alimud, the Derech Alimud in Lubavitch was completely different. They actually learned Alimud Hilchsa, they would learn a sugya, and they would follow it down, Rif, Rosh, Shulchan Aruch. So I don't know which Bnei Yeshiva in particular the Rebbe Rashab had in mind, but it seems like the Rebbe Rashab gehalten that the Bnei Yeshiva in Lubavitch were shayach to at least do some initial looking into the topic. The Rebbe Rashab Bechlal is not even at home, not even with Svarim necessarily, but the Rebbe Rashab was curious, was inquiring whether Bnei Yeshiva had followed up, whether they wrote anything up, and what happened with that. That's all that I am aware of that has been printed. Not clear if there was any progress from there. Not clear if there's any other anything else in writing from the Rebbe Rashab on this that may have been printed or that may not have been printed. If it wasn't, then obviously I can't know about it. And of course, unclear what the psak might have been if it had made it to, let's say, all the facts as described here were confirmed to some extent, what the psak would have been. It would be interesting to see whether there are any tshuvas, maybe farvarfinite tshuvas at the time about something like this, about this or something like this. But since the Rebbe Rashab was expressed interest in knowing what the halacha is, so the final section of our discussion, I'm going to make a tzushtel to an interesting parsha, an interesting case that actually happened about 20 years ago. Tafshin Samach Beis, Tafshin Samach Gimel, 2002, 2003. There was a case where there was a woman where they claimed that the husband has AIDS, and they wanted to argue for Kedushei Tos. And I think that obviously syphilis has been less of an issue since penicillin was invented, which was the end of the 20s. Penicillin more or less eliminated syphilis as a major scourge that it had been before. Although I don't know if I've seen a headline recently that they're now with certain strains of illnesses that are penicillin resistant, antibiotic resistant. Are there strains of syphilis again? I'm not sure. But AIDS, at the peak of AIDS, you could say that AIDS was the top sexually transmitted disease that had perhaps a similar stature in society to syphilis at the time. So it's interesting to see that there actually was a high-profile case 2 decades ago about a case where the allegation was that the husband has AIDS, and this should be the grounds for Kedushei Tos. And so I'm going to quote from Shalos HaTshuvas Shemesh U'Magen, Reb Shalom Mesas, who wrote a number of shtiklach on this parsha. Just I'll point out, we're not going to get too deep into the lumdus of Kedushei Tos. It's more of a general question of precedent, of if you have enough facts lined up, do we actually act, and do we actually paskin that something is Kedushei Tos halacha lamaisa? That's really the larger question that you should be looking out for. So in Shemesh U'Magen Chelik Dal Rav Eliezer Siman Kof, the inyan afkos Kedushim me'adam shenisbar shekodim nisu and hoya bal averis. So Rav Mesas writes that he received this issue, it was referred to him from the Rishon LeZion of Rav Yosef, a psak that was sent him by the Rabbanim of Brooklyn, and they asked Rav Yosef to sign on. Rav Yosef asked Rav Mesas to look into it on Rav Yosef's behalf. Rav Yosef himself is too busy. So that was, you get a sense also of the hierarchy, where there's, as we'll see, Rabbanim in Brooklyn made the psak, but they wanted a high-profile Rav in Eretz Yisrael, and the Rabbanot, or related to the Rabbanot, to sign off, Rav Yosef, and he asked Rav Masas. No names are mentioned here, but as we'll see later, apparently a big name that many are familiar with, that was involved in this psak here in Brooklyn, was Rav Belsky. But this is how Rav Masas writes it. There was a girl from Beis Yaakov. She got married in Cheshvan Tafshin Samach Aleph to a boy under the assumption that he was a ben yeshiva, a regular yeshiva boy. Ad kadei kach, that the girl's side, the woman's side, had taken it upon themselves to support the couple for 4 years, as is common among many mishpachos when you want a ben Torah, ben yeshiva. So they treated him like a real ben yeshiva. They offered 4 years of support, but then it turned out that already a year and a half that this husband, this man, had been stealing consistently from her sister's father-in-law large amounts until at some point it reached the amount of $200,000. It was completely without her sister's father-in-law's knowledge, without his agreement. He was caught. It came to the authorities. The husband admitted his guilt in front of a judge in court, but then he fled. So that was the first problem that blew up this marriage. Then the additional information was that her husband was a roya zaynis. He frequented prostitutes. He was going to brothels and he was hiring. So this was the kind of behavior he was engaging in. So as soon as she heard this, that was according to the way it's described, that was the straw that broke the camel's back. So then she left him and she came to Beis Din asking for a get. And the discussion that took place, not in his presence, in the Beis Din in Yerushalayim, they heard her tainus and harayas. So in that case, they paskin that he has to divorce her immediately, and the way they paskin in the Rabbanut in Israel, that they're going to be koi for him the whole dark kfiyah until he divorces her. But the husband vanished, and the claim is that the husband's family wants to extort millions of dollars from the woman's family, and they threaten that if anyone attempts to actually force to do the kfiyah, that they're going to take revenge and spill blood. The Beis Din in New York says there's a gvias edus from the Beis Din in Johannesburg that this man was already a roya zaynis years before he got married, and there's also some support to this from a detective in Eretz Yisrael, and there is testimony that now as well he's machal yom tov and he eats nevelis. Now there's something you'll notice that I mentioned roya zaynis here. It didn't mention AIDS. There's something a bit odd about how the story is being presented here. You'll see in a moment, and we'll go through the tshuvas. You'll get, if you read it quickly, you'll get the impression that along the way they claimed that he was proven to also have contracted AIDS, and that this was a big part of their case. But if you pay attention carefully, you'll actually see that no one ever actually claimed with any knowledge that he had ever had AIDS, but instead it seems like, at least for 2002, 2003, the claim was that since this is his lifestyle, since he's so licentious, the assumption is that we should just kind of assume that he likely has AIDS due to his reckless behavior, which is an interesting leap logic-wise, and we'll see more about this later. But so that's the story. It doesn't mention AIDS. But then the request, the case now, the woman who comes from a chashuva family, she's asking that she be freed from igon midin kedushay tos. She never agreed to marry a roya zaynis, and being a roya zaynis means that the marriage can't be a marriage. The mamish, it's a pagam in the whole marriage. Why? It's a mum gadol she'enu yochel live. It's a mum that he pashut can't live with her like husband and wife, mishum chashash lamachla mesukena shel AIDS she'ol lahachnas oisel sakana, due to the concern of this dangerous illness of AIDS that would put her in sakana. So if she is with her husband, she'll be in danger of contracting AIDS. So that's the reason why she can't live with him, so therefore she wouldn't agree to marry him, and therefore it's kedushay tos, and therefore we can revoke the marriage retroactively. So, like I said, it's mentioned here as a chashash. They never actually claimed that he had it. It's just some kind of chashash. That's their argument. And if she knew about it, she would never have agreed. A girl from Beis Yaakov, a good family, she would never marry someone like that. And now the Rav Masas is going to quote B'mitzayin to a number of Shalos at Shuvas. And of course, as we've done another shirim, if you wanted, we could look each one up individually and do a long tour de force, but we're not going to do that here. We're just going to rely on his presentation. So this is the background, and the Rebbe Rashab says, I saw the Psak Din of these Rabbanei Brooklyn who wrote at length to be Matu the Isha Mitam Kedushay Tos. Right. So to recap, she originally went to Eretz Yisrael, based in Yerushalayim, and they paskin there should be a get b'kfiyah. But that didn't seem like it was going to work out. So then she went to the Rabbanim of Brooklyn, and they went with this tack of Kedushay Tos, and the Rabbanim of Brooklyn went ahead to be Matu B'Kedam Kedushay Tos, and now they're asking about Yosef, who's asking Rav Masas about whether to sign on to this or not. Now, I haven't seen the original psak that were issued by the Rabbanim of Brooklyn. I don't know if it's easily obtainable, available. We're just going to rely on Rav Masas, etc., quoting it back. So he says they brought a raya from a psak of the great Rav Tzvi Frank Zatzal that was still in manuscript at the time. That now it's printed in Shut Har Tzvi, who quotes him a Chavis Yor, who says a vart that when a Yavama falls before a Mukashchin, so you can't use that to undermine the Kiddushin, the original Kiddushin with his brother, with her original husband. So when they got married, there was no Reyes, so there was no Tos on the Kiddushin. Later, because her husband died, and now she came to the Yavam, so now if there's a problem with the Yavam, so then we say, it's a b'chol dehu nichala, a woman, the way halacha says it is as long as there's some basis for marriage, even if there's so many red flags, other problems, she's happy, and she must have decided that even if there is the chance that this scenario could happen, she's willing to take the risk, and she's miskadesha. So that we have a precedent from Chazal that in the case of a Yavama dafka, the Chavis Yor, quoted by Tzvi Frank, quoted by the Rabbanim of Brooklyn, says, if it was B'shas Kedushin itself, if when she was Niskadish, the person himself, she wanted to marry a healthy person. It turns out he's a chayla. The Chavis Yor says then, even according to Chazal, it's a Kedushin tos, and the Kedushin could be revoked if it's a mum gadol. So that's Tzvi Pesach Frank quoted that, and he quoted a case of the Yitzchak Chanan inspector, the Goyen of Kovna, and a number of tshuvas discussed the case of someone who was unable to be with his wife, Ka'erach Kol Adam, whatever the case was, whatever his defect was, but he couldn't have normal intimacy. So the Tzvi Pesach Frank, quoting the Yitzchak Chanan, quotes the Tashbitz Chelik Aleph Siman Aleph, talks about a case like that as well, back in Italy, back in the 1400s, or just the early 1400s, where there was also a case where the boy couldn't consummate the marriage, and there were some Chachmei Ashkenaz at the time who wanted to be involved in the Kedushin. The Tashbitz didn't seem to want to go along with it, but the Goyen of Kovna says that even the Tashbitz was Doichel Chachmei Ashkenaz, but like Doichel Kol Kach B'Pshitas, he's mistapik b'zeh. So it seems in some case that the Yitzchak Chanan was discussing, there was he was leaning to say that that case as well, where the person couldn't be intimate with his wife, that it's also mum gomer levatel kiddushin, and the different shivas from Yitzchak Chanan about it. The Tzvi Pesach Frank also quoted as an Ur Zerua from the Rishonim, that in Ur Zerua there's a case, someone was niskadish to a shliach, and then it turned out that the Mishaleach is blind in both eyes. So the question was, can you be kaifa for a get? So he said, the Ur Zerua said, when I said you could be kaifa for that, l'ravcha the milsibel, and he has died, she didn't need a get. If she didn't know about the mum, she never met the Mishaleach, she only met the shliach. She didn't know that the shliach is representing someone who's blind, then it's Kedushay Tos. So there's another precedent. There is a rule invoked Kedushay Tos. So we see that in the Mum Gadol, even where he's just blind, there is a rule at Gehalten that it's Mekach Tos, Kedushin Abatel. That was Tzvi Pesach Frank discussing some case that came up to him in his time. So the Rabbanim of Brooklyn quoted Frank, who quoted all these Mekayres, And the Rabbanim of Brooklyn concluded, and they said that even though we find that there are cases in Achreinim where they dealt with similar, where the man can't be intimate with his wife, and yet we find that they were machmir. So the precedent more recently is not to say it's kedushay tos, but the reason why they were machmir was they said maybe he can be healed, or maybe still we say tav l'meisa tandu, maybe they can't be fully intimate, but they can cuddle chibuk v'nishuk. She can get something out of it. Maybe people would settle for a marriage like that. You can't prove that it's not a marriage that anyone would agree to at all. So the Rabbanim Brooklyn said that's why the Achreinim were machmir in those cases. But b'chol ze'erim didn't be done, because if we accept that he has AIDS, so then she has to stay away from him. She can't be near him at all. Although I guess that also is negate common beliefs versus the science of how AIDS can be spread. Whether or not it could be spread by chibuk v'nishuk and contact is, I guess, also a technical question. But that's what the Rabbanim of Brooklyn said, that if it's a terrible machla, so then there's no marriage can function at all. It's a be'etzem nishkein marriage. So Mamela, that would strengthen the case to say that we should go with kedushay tos. And they quoted the Eitzar HaPoskim that quotes a case that came before the Beis Din of London that was written by Rebbe Cheskel Abramsky, also someone that didn't have Gevuras HaNashim, also someone that couldn't be intimate. And after Rebbe Cheskel Abramsky wrote a number of reasons why it's kedushay tos. And like we said, this vart, that marriage is to live together as husband and wife. So if they can't live together as husband and wife, then the whole kedushin falt avek. So Cheskel Abramsky was also writing in this to this effect in that case as well. Cited in Eitzar HaPoskim. They also quoted in Igros Moshe, where he also talked about someone who had the same problem. And the Moshe said in that case that if it's taka true, and taka was the case before they got married as well, and there's no way to get to receive a get at all, then we shouldn't be ma'agan her, and we should be matim mitam kedushay tos. So there's precedent from the Igros Moshe as well. And they were mitzayin to other shalos hatshuvas, the Sheidas Yosef Reisen, the Chaim Shel Shalom Toibis, the Sri Yesh, who also wrote. It seems like they were talking about a case of a mumar, where they said as well that it's kedushay tos, and there's no room to assume that Shema As Tshuva. So if the husband himself, put aside the chalitza cases, but if the husband himself turns out to be a mumar, so there is seemingly precedent to say it's kedushay tos. So based on all this, the Chachmei Brooklyn said, you can be vatal the kedushin. There's no chance that a Haredi girl would agree to marry a Reya Zionist and a mumar, like the Sheidas Yosef just cited a few lines ago says about a mumar. About his case, he writes, "Shehimi absulas hakshedas." She's a kasher girl. So kamat barely da mekach tos. It's almost certain that it's a mekach tos. Befrat b'zman hazeh, especially now, he's saying that on the mumar. You can't live with him. You can't have marital life together. B'chlal. There's no way she can live with him. They're not going to be under the same roof. So ain't svara lemer tandu. You can't say tav l'mesav tandu. She ain't kan tandu. Ain't kan in mila mesav. There's no two, and there's no sitting. There's none of it. So you can't say tav l'mesav if there's no mesav. That was what the Sheidas Yosef said in that case. So based on this logic, the Rabbani of Brooklyn said that this is another such case. And 5 big Rabbanim signed on it with their seal. The Av based in Brooklyn, New York. Igad Rabbanim to America, Av based in Queens, New York. Reish Yeshiva Shari Torah Muncie, New York. The Mal based in Tzedek Miyuchad, the Yoni Ishus, Brooklyn, New York. And they were joined by a Dayan of Agudas Israel, Chicago, Illinois. This is all of Mesas describing the psak that he saw of these Rabbanim. So I also saw in the case that a private detective who's recognized by the Israeli government also testified that someone told him that he knows the husband very well, and he's attesting to the fact that this husband arranged a party in Malone Dan, I assume a hotel in Israel, in a suite, and he invited Nairis Zainis, and this is the kind of stuff the husband was up to. And Mesas adds that the detective adds that this guy continued and said that in his bedroom, on his night table, there was cocaine. So I don't know how many times that's mentioned in Shalos and Shuvas, but it's mentioned here. So this is setting the scene of what this guy was up to just on this one occasion, this one instance that this detective got someone to report about. And then in the end, he left or fled the hotel to avoid the police. So that's just one particular incident that happened in Israel. Now, Shalom Asah says, I myself, in my Sefer, Shemesh U'Magen Chelik Gimel, Even Ezra Simcha Chav Zayin, I already presented my take on Mekach Tos Barichos, and I did a survey of all the Gdolei HaPoskim. And the reality is that Reiv Poskim, even though Daitem Noite Lahakol, Mitam Mekach Tos, you often will find Poskim saying, really, we feel we should be Mekel. In calls Lamaisa, Hemireim Lahater Bleget. But Lamaisa, when it comes to practice, they're hesitant, they're afraid to say she can literally just revoke the Kedushin without receiving a get. Only a minority, Ma'at Poskim, were masking to Mevatel Kedushin Midiraisa. And that's Taka the Igris Moshe. And there's also the Beis Av. The Beis Av is Taka also reviewed the Levitz in some case where he also said you don't need a get. And so that's why I quoted this in Chelik Gimel. And I quoted many other poskim in my Chelik Gimel that the Rabbani Brooklyn quoted, the Sudei, the Chavis Yar, Hari Besamim. So the way I summed it up is Machlekes Gedola Bein HaPoskim. B'Chamad Rev HaPoskim Oisrim B'li Get. V'chein Alti L'Halacha. So when it came up then, my take was that ultimately, based on surveying the scene, the landscape, the halachic landscape, we don't paskin lamaisa to use to employ kedushay tos. Because even the machlekes itself creates a suffix. But if there's another suffix, then I can use it as a svek sveka. Like we know we're more familiar with Raji Yosef uses this a lot. A svek sveka using the machlekes, that machlekes itself is one suffix. So there were some cases where I was matter when it was a svek sveka, but as a suffix alone, we don't want to venture into a suffix if it's a machlekes, but they're not paiskim. That's my usual stance. But in this case, where Rabbani Brooklyn proved that it's mamish sakana to go for the woman to be with him, and maybe even chibuk nishuk is a sakana. That was the claim that even chibuk nishuk she can catch AIDS. The hevir eyes l'zem divrei paiskim that they're all mekel when there's a sakana. So I'm also mitzdaref to be mater, this choshev woman, this fruma woman. She innocently married a ben yeshiva, and they wanted to support him for 4 years. Obviously, based on all the context, she never would have imagined to marry such a ramai who's a reya zainus and a mummer, and he consumes drugs, and he eats the veils of terefis, and he's mechal yomtiv, and he's dangerous to the woman. So for a man like this who also disappeared and we can't get the get from him to be mater. And then he says, interesting lashon, I don't know how often you see this. He says, Amnom re'isi bisifri. Then I saw in my own sefer, in that simon, b'shem the Melui Evan, that after he was married after we mekel, but in that case, whatever that case was, he concluded and he said, still kasher lahakol. So, you know what? To be matzah me'a'igon, we should also be mezakeh her a get b'shlichus abal shalem idaitoi, because it's a schos. So we can also just create a get, the shlichus for the baal without his knowledge, because we consider it to be a schos, so if we can add that component here as well, to add a get, and now I'm sending it back to Rav Yosef for his approval, and it's his decision. His decision will be final. Messah signed this. But if you look in the next siman in Shemesh U'Magen, he writes, after I wrote the psak din, the father of the man showed up. He surfaced, and he showed up with a blood test of his son. He did it in a laboratory, and it says the name of the laboratory, and the laboratory confirmed that he does not have AIDS. So the whole maisa with AIDS, nishke steigen, nishke fleigen, or whatever equivalent expression you want to use. And he also had other complaints about the psak din of the Rabbanim in New York. He says that even though the testimony came from detectives that are acknowledged, approved detectives, but the detectives themselves didn't see anything. It's not that the private detectives tracked the husband and were able to report this happened. They just spoke to a bunch of people and they reported a bunch of shmuas, rumors, and the people they spoke to were all noitzrim and noitzrius. They weren't Jewish. So they found a woman who said that she lived with him. I guess she was his mistress. And they received sheicha, and it's sheker. Pialacha, what kind of, these are not real edison. You can't rely on this. So I said to them, to the husband's family, Abazoi, why didn't you come to Beis Din to say this and to taina these tainas? They wouldn't have paskin shlei b'fanav. They believed everything the woman said. So the father said he couldn't come. Why couldn't he come? Because he himself was being held in jail in New York due to this whole financial disaster, that the money that was stolen or embezzled from the relative. So somehow it seems like the father himself ended up in jail, and he had to pay $70,000, maybe bond or restitution, and he got out. So he just got out of jail. He also never got the hazmana. He didn't know about it. And they said, Bechlal, the husband is willing to give a get. You're saying that the guy won't give a get. He's willing to give a get on the condition that you retract all the things that they've put out there about him. All these things aren't true. And also he added that, by the way, all the money that he stole and embezzled, all the money was for his wife, was for his wife's expenses. So the story isn't the way you were told. So when this information came to Rebbe Masas, this was a few days later. This is dated Ches Kislev, Tafshin Samach Gimel. The previous one is Chav Ches Cheshvan. So somehow things started moving very quickly. So if he's everything I wrote, it'll be matter like get, like the Chacham in New York, and because of the contagious disease, the laboratory confirmed there's no such disease. And when they sort of laundered the witnesses, the testimony, they said they're based in New York, heard from the based in Johannesburg, it is Raya Zionist, but they never traced it back. Who were the original sources? It's all Nisht Yidden. And that wasn't clear. We just accepted whatever they said. But now we got more detailed VS Edus directly from the base in Johannesburg, and we saw that the private detective that came before them isn't Jewish, and the woman who claimed she was his mistress wasn't Jewish. So this is not Edus that can just be accepted. So therefore, everything we wrote about Mekachtos, Bleget, due to the disease, there's no place in Lamakim, because the doctor said there's no such thing. And the Edus about his character, we see it's all from non-Jews. So therefore, the Baal has to show up in Beis Din, and he has to make his case. And at any rate, I retract the heter that I gave, and we have to revert to being chayshish to Reiv Paiskim, that we're not mekel in Mekach Tos without a get as well. Kam Dina, the maskana is you can't be mad to the issue without a get. And I'm contradicting what I wrote in my first psak, because all of that has turned out not to be true. Side the disease, side the behavior that he was alleged to have engaged in. And he concludes, he says, look in the Sefer Mishpat Tzedakah B'Yaakov, I believe it's one of the Sfaradish Sfarim, maybe from 200-300 years ago, I don't remember exactly. But the Mishpat Tzedakah B'Yaakov, in a certain case, writes, She'ein bush alaymer hadri bi. Shouldn't be embarrassed, even a Rav, a Beis Din, shouldn't be embarrassed to retract once the MS comes to light. There being a raya from the Rosh, from the Rambam, from the Chachmei Talmud. That's the makar. If you want to see a makar on retraction in Torah, in Halacha, that would be a good place to look. So the Rebbe Rashab is invoking that to say, I can also retract, I can also say it was an error. He signed this Wednesday, Ches Kislev. So it's also Ches Kislev, interestingly, not the same excitement as finding a letter of the Rebbe Rashab, but also Ches Kislev, Tafshin Samach Gimel. And this comes with the Haskama of Rav Yosef. Ani maskim, I agreed to what Rav Masas wrote. Le'ein lahatir se'eshes anabli get. And also originally, when I read the original psak, Rav Yosef says, to be honest, I didn't want to agree. I didn't want to be matir. I had a bad feeling about it. So I'm happy to see that niskavanti la'amito shel davar, that I was agreeing to what the reality was, what the truth was. So she's bechaskas eishes ish, and Chachmei New York have to reconvene and start again. Interestingly, if you look in Menashe Klein, of course, Paisik from Borough Park, I've mentioned on other occasions that I grew up around his shul. I saw him many times growing up in Borough Park. So he has a series Mishnah Halachas, Chelik Yud Zayin Semim Vav, which has shuvas from as late as Tafshin Samach Gimel. There is a letter from Dal B'Shalach Tafshin Samach Gimel, which is equivalent to Yud Beis Shvat, written to Rav Masas, and he writes to Rav Masas, I saw you 2 letters, and this corresponds to the 2 psakim taka that are printed now in Shemesh and Magen. And Menashe Klein summarizes that he got in trouble with credit cards and theft, and he was brought to jail, to court. And then she left her husband, she went to Yerushalayim, and they said that the first psak that he has to divorce, but that never happened. And then, for some strange reason, they came back to Brooklyn and they started over again as if it's a new case. And both cases were done without the husband's participation. And now this new psak, mevatel the kedushin, and they claim because he has AIDS and because he's a roya zaynis and because he's a mummer, he behaves like he's from, but he's not really from the stuff that aren't from. And they sent it to Rabbi Yosef, and Yosef referred it to you, and you were done lefituma. You relied on everything that they said. You were relying on the chazaka, based in so you didn't challenge any of the facts that they sent you. So v'samach atzma b'shteyadav al Rabbani Brooklyn. Every time it says Rabbani Brooklyn in this, it's in quotation marks, like ironic quotes. Al Rabbani Brooklyn, and maybe partially, maybe sort of making fun of the way Rav Masas kept referring to them, or also indicating that he doesn't respect them as Rabbanim. And you also were leading to join them, but then you found out from the laboratory that never happened, and you found out that from Johannesburg that the Eidus of the Raya Zaynis is also a sheker. I think Rasha Klein might be taking it an extra step, but Leihidu all of Klon, Legavu Eidus mi Yisrael, there's only a Neitzri, Shushama Migoyacha, Shushama Migoya. So what kind of Eidus is that? So these are all inshi mali, people who are no good, or mitzi shemral, abal, and it's all ultimately goes back to the words of one Goya in Johannesburg. That's the basis that he's a Goya Zionist, and that's the basis that he has AIDS, and that's the basis of the whole heter. All comes back to that source. And then Yutaka wrote your second letter, and he quotes, Rav Nachman quotes from the second letter, and then Rabbi Yosef wrote, and he quotes about Yosef. So Rasha Klein says, I just want to follow up on this case. Aniya Kot, and I say, you're right, you wrote at the end, there's no busha to retract, to say Hadar Nabi, Adrabah, there's godless. It shows godless that you're willing to admit when you're wrong. And he brings a case in Yerushalmi, Eini Boish Leimar, that's a Gavre Rabba. You have to look there to see the exact story. Meish Rabbeinu also, Hoidev Leiboish Leimar Le Shamaiti, El Shamaiti V'Shechachti. So that Moshe was also willing to admit to the truth. So that's those cases in from Tanakh and Chazal. Kol shekain mishatah bedin. If you got the din wrong, of lahayd salamas, you have to admit in busha. So upon him, the fact that you retracted, I only have praise for you. But the fact that the first psak ever happened, to make sure this doesn't happen again, I would like to share a few questions that I have. Number one, how could you be done the Baal Shlei B'fanav Shlei Kalacha Sichei Shemishpat Simin Chavchas and Simin Yud Gimel? Number two, the whole thing, and here Rav Klein really emphasizes this point. The whole heter was a Shema. Maybe he has AIDS because he's claimed to be a Reya Zionist. How can you rely on that without actually confirming anything? It seems like no one ever actually went to investigate whether he has any illness at all. Certainly, such a terrible contagious disease. That turns out the Taka didn't, and the Taka wasn't true. So they should at least have been. In doubt. How can you rely on that? About the kedushin vadai. The kedushin vadai, and the woman is an ish vadai. So if now you have a suffix, the suffix is connected to vadai. He's ma'idach a little bit. It's a suffix connected to vadai. Number three, even if it was true, let's say the laboratory test came back and he did have AIDS. And let's agree to the Rabbani Brooklyn that say that if he has AIDS, then he's not royally issues. Even in that case, Rav Nachman says you still couldn't be about to the Kedushin without a get, because everyone agrees that B'Shas Kedushin, they didn't know that he's a royal Zionist, that there's a chance that he has AIDS. Adrabah, they said that he seemed like a yeshiva bach who wants to sit 4 years learning after marriage, and that was the mindset. And even the Achar Chas, they lived together for a while. Kederach ish ve'isha, hakoil kecheskas bari, everything was said to be normal. They didn't have any claims about anything, any red flags after the wedding. Now, Chachma New York come with this new thing from Johannesburg that he's a Zionist, it's been going on, he's continuing, Mistami has AIDS. Basin should have investigated. Even if he did, when did he catch it? Was it Taka before he got married, and he was Taka or Zionist before, or was it only after the Nisuin and he was healthy? Because we know they lived together. And of course, if it was only, let's say he had it, but it was only from after the Kedushin, you can't be about the Kedushin from Machla that he received afterwards. And there's a musik of a chaskas chayim that you always assume that someone is alive. So derech zeh, you always assume that someone is bari, there's a chaskas bari. You assume he's healthy until an hour before the test came back positive that he has the disease. So even if we had a confirmation, the kedushin wouldn't be batal, because we at the very least wouldn't be sure when he contracted the disease. That he didn't have it, certainly didn't have AIDS, because they lived together and she never caught it. If he had it, why didn't she catch it? And if she somehow is immune, so then your whole mekachta kind of falls down. She can move back in with him, with the AIDS, with everything. Apparently she's immune, she doesn't catch it. That's number 3. Number four, even if he had this machla, even if he had AIDS b'shas kedushin, you can't be mafkir kedushin bli get. So he's building, imtim telemer that he had a b'shas kedushin. Kol according to Menashe Klein, kol achreinim sogru lonu al Pesach, they shut the door. Shaloi levatel kedushin midin mekachtos zman hazeh. That's, it's very nice. Kedushin mekachtos exists in theory. We don't use it. Le'inu v'kamat le'shamanu v'doides ha'achreinim v'afilu l'rishonim sheyismachu levatel kedushin mafreya afilu al dvarim ha'imdim urim shel olam. He says we didn't see, we almost never heard in the later generations, and even in the early generations. He seems to acknowledge that Amol, they had more breitkeit, and today we have less. But even the Rishonim, to actually rely to be about the Kedushin Mafreya, even no matter how big the issue is, certainly for no reason, just based on tinus, they heard from one side without hearing the other side. And I agree that if someone has this machla and she can't live with him, then koifen oisi lahoitzi, that's like a mukashchin, but koifen for a get, not bittul kedushin. Kol shekain, if you don't even know he has the machla, Kol shekain, you didn't know he had b'shas kedushin. So pshita, you can't be about the kedushin. Even if it was all, again, even if it was proven to be a fact, ha'achreinim sagru aleinu ha'pesach. According to Menashe Klein, this door is closed and that's it. There's nothing there. There's nothing to discuss. Number 5. Moreover, there was a previous case in Yerushalayim, and they never mentioned bittul kedushin. Their psak was just to be mechayev a get. So adarabah, they paskin to look for legarish. So obviously the Beis Din had gehalten that there was kedushin gemurim, and no one raised any questions about the kedushin. So I'm wondering why you're relying more on the michtav Rabbani America mirichuk makim that are here to turn the whole thing upside down. Why don't you ask? How's this contradicting the two batei din? Rabbani of Brooklyn are saying achas dasit about the kedushin, and that's the opposite of what the Beis Din Yerushalayim knock from the Rabbanut. Paskin that betoykif to be koyfel agarish in gerushin yeshkan kedushin yeshkan. If they're paskin to be megarish, obviously they're kedushin. At the very least, why don't you reach out to the Beis Din Yerushalayim to hear their version, to hear what they know? Did they hear these tainas? What do they know about it? Agam shein Beis Din medaktik achar Beis Din chavera. Even though there is the precedent that you trust whatever another Beis Din tells you. But if that was the case, if that was the rule we were working with, then how did the Rabbani Brooklyn come and were beidik achar Beis Din Yerushalayim to be bevatel the kedushin? Hapech of that psak. So if we're already overturning what previous Badi Din said, you should have spoken to the first Beis Din. You should have double-checked the facts of the second Beis Din. Number 6, benkach ubenkach tiksha. Why was it not surprising to you that this came to Brooklyn? Why are Chachmei Brooklyn involved in the coming to Rav Yosef? If the Beis Din Yerushalayim had an issue, they could have gone to Rav Yosef directly. Why does it have to go all the way around through Brooklyn? Why do you have to move the diyun from Eretz Yisrael to Brooklyn to be Malta Kedushin there? Are there nobody didn't be in Eretz Yisrael? They have to come to the Beis Din Hagadol, quote unquote, in Brooklyn. Doesn't this seem like there's trickery at play here? Doesn't it seem like they knew they had no chance of getting this psak in Eretz Yisrael? And why didn't it erase? Why weren't you surprised? Why weren't you? Why wasn't a red flag that the Rabbani Brooklyn are getting involved when Beis Din Yerushalayim already paskin something? Number 1, Rabbani Brooklyn. Why didn't they ask her themselves why she's coming to Brooklyn? And if you're going to claim that they didn't know about the Beis Din of Yerushalayim themselves, that the woman's family withheld that psak as well, so then that proves that the Beis Din of Brooklyn isn't doing a good job. They didn't find this information themselves. And when you got this letter from Brooklyn with the psak of Bittul Kedushin, why wasn't it not surprising to you? Why are they getting involved? They're coming about Yosef, something that was already discussed in Yerushalayim. sort of, being a little repetitive and circular here, it seems. But I guess to really drive the point home, doesn't it seem like there's arma? Doesn't it seem like there's something that's not glatt, not okay? I think there's actually some repetition of the actual text. I think the text is actually duplicated here twice. At any rate, number 7. Gam etzem hadover. The whole thing is very surprising to me. I saw in your tshuva at the Maisa was a woman who married a chassan. She thought he's a ben yeshiva, and she found that he stole $200,000. He was using credit cards without permission, and they brought him to court. He admitted he fled, and they found out he's a Zionist. Says apparently, until the Gnev and their cars came to light, the marriage was fine. No one ever claimed that he's a mu'min or a Zionist and he has AIDS. Suddenly, when he was caught with the financial stuff, all of a sudden, all this other stuff comes to light. What's going on here? And by the way, those are his 7 questions that he wants to have Rebbe Rashab question the whole process of how this ever came to happen. Then Rebbe Rashab goes on to say that you're quoting Rebbe Buchner are quoting the 2 Pesach Frank, who quoted the Tashbitz, Chelek Aleph, Siman Aleph, and the way it says it there is that the Tashbitz was doich, even though he was doich the Chachmei Ashkenaz wanted to be vatal the Kedushin, it wasn't the Pshitos, it was mistapik. By the way, this case in the Tashbitz, I believe, is the same case that's in the Shas Chuvas Rivosh, Siman Kuf Chav Zayin, which I once actually cited in a shir in relation to what Tzemach Tzedek. Tzemach Tzedek had a discussion with David Nehemiah about a relative of David Nehemiah, a whole parsha. And there's this idea that Bnei Yisrael Hatznuos, the Rivash has this line, the Bnei Yisrael Hatznuos are willing to suffer a lot to give the marriage a chance. You can't just assume that they want out immediately. So I did believe I quoted from that shot from Rivash. It was about the same case. It was a case in Italy with a young man who didn't seem to have Vodas Anashim, and then he ran away. A whole Maisa. So you're bringing this claim. Rebbe Nasha Klein says that the Tashbitz was Deicher Chachmei Ashkenaz, but not fully. He says if you look in the Tashbitz, I don't see what you're talking about. What they're talking about. The Tashbitz is not mistapik, but Dover he quotes the Tashbitz. Also, Rav Henkin, Chidushi Ivra. Rav Henkin discussed these issues, and Rav Henkin wrote Chidushi Ivra Ois Mem Zayin. He says Lo Shamanu V'Lo Yadanu Mimois Hashas Yevat Lo Kedushin Machmas Mum. B'yichud achar nisuin lamaisa, meaning mele kedushin before nisuin, but after nisuin, b'yivatul machmas mum, v'chol makom v'chol zman nimtzu shelis ka'elo, b'kulam etzrichu gad. Whenever these issues came up, they always said lamaisa, you should also do a get. So, hariyad inon sha'akon nechnas l'safek v'yaf shlebat kedushin klal, fil ha'im b'vur ha'mum v'shleiyad menu atzal ha'sheni. So that Rav Henkin is pretty clear as well, like Rav Nasha Klein, that it's not a tool in the toolkit. We don't use kedushin tos. Also in Ois Mem Ches, he says, I thought this was enough to be mevatel the whole musig of course kedushin, bittul kedushin, but I heard that it's catching on. They're all saying they're relying on the base of Rav Yehuda Levitz and those with him. So Rav Henkin said, I have to debunk, I have to quote their Taimei HaHeter and be seiser the Taimei HaHeter. So he starts quoting. So there Rav Henkin starts quoting the various rayas, the various mekoros that were cited, many cases of where the man was chassid Vodas Anashim, and Rav Henkin was doiche all of these rayas, lefi his mahalach. And on Eistam Beis, again, Rav Henkin writes, the Timtzim David of Yisenu, Shebitl Kiddushin, Elek Shahoyo the Kfir Veramos. They're only about the Kiddushin if the Kiddushin themselves, where the man imposed it, or there's some very outright trickery going on, in the Etzam Maisa Kedushin, then they would also throw in maybe there's a problem with the Eden as well. But Kedushin Kederach Kol Yisrael, Ef Shalavatlam, Loya de Mumin, Loya de Chipas Bekashas Eden. If it's regular Kedushin, then you can't start throwing in Psuli Eidos and Mumin. That was Rav Henkin's very clear stance. Says in their letter, Bnei Brooklyn, they said even Achrayna, they were machmir. It's because maybe if the person can't be intimate, maybe it can be fixed. Tavla Mesa Tandu, maybe lesser degrees of intimacy are enough. But they said Chose Ein Dan because of the AIDS. Says the miyot of they quoted the miyot, a few that were discussed Dan given. Shadonu bebittul kedushin zman hazeh. Menashe Klein says, "Hagam shel ha'maisa gam hani mi'utoli osu maisa lebatel hakedushin belin asinas get mishum chomadei shazish." Look up we can all, I guess, go and research it for ourselves. But Menashe Klein asserts that all the Makairos that were cited, none of them ever actually were matir Pikudushay Tos outright. It was part of the factor, it was part of the discussion, they were leaning towards it, etc., etc. Says Haniya Kadavar Azeh, all the Paiskim are going L'chumra, you have to be Chayshish Lamamzeros, and even those that are Mitzad L'Hakol, but L'maisa, they didn't dare be Mekel, and in New York, it's the Hepech. Even if Rev Ruba de Ruba are Machmer, but because Miyuta de Miyuta are Mater, and they never even acted on it, which is still be Mitzad of Daitam to be Mater, became a Heter Gomer. Chalal, he says the whole thing, Shemu Shemayim, to Mitzah Shemra and a year to say that he has AIDS without ever proving it, without ever researching it, and not to trick the base in Eretz Yisrael, to tell him things that aren't true. Even the Shita Sam, they never proved that he had AIDS. They said, because it's a Reya Zainu, so we should assume he has AIDS, so therefore, these time and these demyonis on the Bevata Kedushin Yisuan, Mefkei Israel Ish. And this also Toyd Lakel turned out not to be true, etc., etc. We can't go through the whole entire arichas, but the emissary the Darkoi that this whole basin, he starts speaking ma'ara on this basin that it's not the first time. Over the Bashon, Nasam Keheter, this is their dayach, this is their mahalach. He starts saying other hetanim they give to be most people to our cause. We're not going to get into all of that, but you can look it up and see what Menashe Klein had to say. And we're going to be Mekatzer here, but that's Rav Menashe Klein's lengthy taina to Rav Masas. If you look back in Shemush Magim Chelik Daled, Even Ezer, in the next Simon Kuf Beis, there's a letter from Rav Masas to Rav Yeshaya Tuvia Halevi. I believe that would be Rav Yeshaya Tuvia Halevi, director, I believe of Los Angeles. And it's not clear if he was writing about this case or a related case. In the first paragraph, Rav Masas sort of summarizes all the different pieces of the letters and the psakim, and here he mentions Rav Belsky's name explicitly, which hadn't been mentioned in the sources above. So you can look there as well to see what other details there might be there as well. I'll conclude by mentioning, if you look in the Sefer Yiso Yosef, or Yosef, I believe Yosef Efrati, or Efrati, Rav Yashav's aide, Rav Efrati, Chelek Vav, Even Ezer, Simon Kuf Ches, page Kuf Yud Ches, Kuf Yud Tes, he writes there that there was a Ma'aseh Shahaya and Tafshet Hamach Beis, and it sounds like it's talking about the same case, where Rav Yosef, I think he mentioned they were talking about being matter with Kedushay Tos. When it came to Rav Yashav said something to the effect of, we can open the door for Kedushay Tos, even if you believe at this case it's applicable and it's perfectly fine. Rav Yashav said we don't want to go down that route, we don't want to open that door. So that's another source relating to that case. At any rate, just to summarize back to the Rebbe Rashab, interestingly, did raise this as a possibility. We see from other Shas Chuvas as well that the issue of Kedushay Tos had come up in various Shas Chuvas for Ein Legvuras Hanashim or for a Mummer. So the discussion was sort of out there, and then a while later, the base of apparently it was one of his Tatum that he ran with, and it garnered a lot of backlash. So it's interesting that the Rebbe Rashab sort of went into it. It looks like a little bit betmimos. Like I said, it looks like he's trying to advocate and just try to help this family out that he met. And so the Rebbe Rashab was at least open to bringing the Shaila to Rabbanim to pursue Kedushay Tos in a case of syphilis, where at least hopefully in that case it was an actual confirmed case. Although the Rebbe Rashab also did say that a Rav researching it should actually visit the institution to see the man himself. So it's interesting to compare and contrast the two cases. Of course, Rebbe Rashab was only speaking very much in theory and wanted the Gedolei Harabanim Dafka to be done b'Zeh L'maisa. And as we began as well, where the Rebbe Rashab was generally al ha'omed al mishmar to when the Rabbanim Mitam, the government, wanted to just change the laws of Rabbanim, laws of Chalitza, that was something that he was obviously not going to stand for. So that is uncharted territory, unexplored piece of history involving the Rebbe Rashab connected to this day's dates.